On the morning of July 18th, 2011, Kevin Marsh opened the lid of the chest freezer in his equipment shed and found 380 pounds of pork that had been thawing for 4 days in 92-degree Tennessee summer heat. The power had been out since July 14th. A tornado had passed 2 miles north of the farm in the early morning hours, taking out the transmission lines serving most of Giles County. The power company estimated restoration in 7 to 10 days. Kevin had not checked the freezer until the 18th because he had been managing the rest of the storm's aftermath. A section of fence down, a hay barn with a damaged roof, a week of cleanup work that kept him away from the equipment shed until that morning. He stood at the open lid for a moment. The smell told him the answer before the sight confirmed it. 4 days at 92 degrees with no refrigeration. The pork, 2 hogs he had processed in November of 2010, cut and wrapped and frozen, 380 pounds of roasts and chops and ground and ribs, was gone. Not salvageable. Not even partly salvageable. Gone. He closed the lid. He stood in the equipment shed for a while. Then he called his father. "Doyle," Kevin said when Doyle answered. Doyle said, "I figured you'd call." Kevin said, "The freezer." "All of it." Doyle was quiet for a moment. He said, "How bad?" Kevin said, 400 pounds. Close to it. He paused. "I didn't check it until this morning." Doyle said, "Come over this afternoon." He paused. "Bring a cooler if you've still got anything worth saving from the house freezer." Kevin said, "What have you got?" Doyle said, "What I've got is hanging in the smokehouse where it has been since February." He paused. "Same place it always is." Kevin drove to the home place that afternoon. He found Doyle in the smokehouse, which is where Doyle spent part of every afternoon in summer, checking the hams, checking the temperature, managing the damper on the firebox to keep the interior at the specific ambient temperature that aged country ham requires. The smokehouse was at 88 degrees inside. Outside it was 93. The difference was the concrete block walls, 8 inches thick, that had been regulating temperature in this structure since Virgil built it in 1948. Kevin looked at the hams hanging from the smoke hooks, dark mahogany on the exterior, firm to the touch, the hickory cure visible in the color and the texture of the surface. 8 hams, 2 whole shoulders, 4 slabs of bacon, all processed in December of 2010 and January of 2011, cured and smoked and hung in February, now 5 months along, in their aging and completely unaffected by the power outage because the smokehouse does not require electricity and had not required electricity on any day since 1948. Kevin said, "How much do you have in there?" Doyle said, "About 220 pounds cured weight." He looked at the hams. "That is 2 hogs' worth." Kevin said nothing for a moment. He looked at the hams. He said, "I told you in 2005 that this building was a fire hazard." Doyle said, "You did?" Kevin said, "I said a chest freezer was more practical." Doyle said, "You did." Kevin looked at the ham nearest to him. He said, "How long do these keep in here?" Doyle said, "A properly cured country ham will keep at room temperature for 12 to 18 months. He paused. "These have been in here 5 months." He looked at Kevin. "They have 7 more months before I need to move them." Kevin said, "Without power," Doyle said. "Without power, without refrigeration, without anything except salt and smoke and time." He looked at his son. "That is what curing is. It is preservation that does not depend on a grid. Let me tell you about Virgil Marsh, because you need to understand the man before you can understand why he built the Smokehouse in 1948 when every new farm in Giles County was buying a chest freezer instead. Virgil had been born in 1908. He had grown up on a farm in Giles County without electricity. The rural electrification programs had not reached the back roads of Middle Tennessee until the late 1930s. And even after the lines came through, the reliability of rural Tennessee power in the 1940s was not the reliability you might assume. Lines went down, storms came through, the power was out 4 days at a time in a way that anyone who had lived in rural Tennessee before 1960 understood as a normal feature of life rather than an emergency. His mother had cured meat in a smokehouse her entire life. Her mother before her had cured meat in a smokehouse. Now, the practice went back in the family to before any living person could remember, back to the time when the smokehouse was not an option or a tradition, but simply the answer to the question of how you keep pork through the summer in Tennessee without refrigeration. In the summer of 1936, when Virgil was 28 and farming the Giles County place he had just bought from a retiring neighbor, the power had been out for 11 days in August, after a severe thunderstorm system passed through the county. He had a chest freezer in the equipment shed, a relatively new purchase, bought in 1934 when he had connected to the rural line. He had 60 pounds of pork in it. He had lost all 60 pounds. He had not needed to lose the pork. His mother had a smokehouse 30 miles away. She had not lost any pork. She had cured hams hanging in her smokehouse that August of 1936 that would have been untouched by 11 days of heat if the temperature had been 130 degrees rather than 96. In the fall of 1936, Virgil had written to his mother and asked her to describe the cure she used, the salt ratios, the smoke temperature, the timing, the wood species. She had written back 4 pages in her careful hand. He had put the letter in the farm ledger where he kept important documents. He had built the smokehouse in 1948, not in a hurry or in a crisis. He had built it deliberately 12 years after the 1936 outage, because he had spent those 12 years watching the pattern of power reliability in Giles County and deciding that a farm with only one method of meat preservation was a farm with one point of failure, and that one point of failure was not satisfactory. He had built it to his mother's specifications from her letter. Concrete block walls, cedar interior, separate firebox, adequate smoke hooks for 4 hogs worth of product. He had used it every year from 1948 through the year he handed the farm to Doyle in 1972. He had told Doyle 2 things when he handed the farm over. The first was practical. The cure is 1 pound salt, 4 ounces brown sugar, per 10 pounds of meat, 7 days in the cool, 14 days of smoke at 80 to 90 degrees, 60 days minimum aging before you touch it. He had said, "The letter from your grandmother is in the ledger if you need it." He paused. "You won't need it, but it's there." The second was the sentence, "Learn to cure before you learn to freeze." He said, "The smokehouse does not require electricity, and the chest freezer does." He looked at Doyle. "No, both." He paused. "Rely on the one that does not need a grid." Doyle had known both since he was 12. He had learned to cure alongside Virgil every December and January from 1955 onward. The specific process of salt rubbing and temperature management and smoke control, that Virgil had learned from his mother's letter and that his mother had learned from watching her own mother. He had started doing the smokehouse processing himself when he took over the farm. He had not stopped when he bought the chest freezer. He had never planned to stop. Let me tell you about the chest freezer and what it is actually for, because there are two systems in this story, and the error is not that Kevin had a chest freezer. The error is that Kevin had nothing else. A chest freezer is a genuinely excellent meat preservation system in conditions where the power grid is reliable. It is fast. You can freeze fresh pork the same day you process a hog. It is convenient. You can access any cut at any time without the planning that cured meat requires. It is precise. You can control exactly what you use and when. In normal conditions, the chest freezer is unambiguously more convenient than a smokehouse in every practical respect. The chest freezer has one vulnerability. It requires electricity. Not most of the time, all of the time, every day, every hour, continuously, from the moment the meat goes in until the moment it comes out. One extended power interruption in warm weather ends the system completely and irrecoverably. The smokehouse is slower and requires more skill. The curing process takes 3 weeks, and the aging takes 2 to 3 months minimum. You cannot cure a ham in July and eat it in August. The timing does not work for summer emergencies. The smokehouse requires a winter kill if you are using it for warm weather preservation, which means planning 6 months ahead. It requires specific temperature management. It requires wood and time and knowledge. But the smokehouse does not require electricity. The salt and smoke that preserve a country ham have been preserving pork for longer than electricity has existed. They work in August when the grid is down and the temperature is 93 degrees outside, the same way they worked in August before there was a grid at all. A properly cured country ham hanging in a concrete block smokehouse at 90 degrees inside is not in danger. It is exactly where it should be, doing what salt and smoke and time do to pork, which is remove the water that bacteria need to operate and replace the surface chemistry with compounds that bacteria find inhospitable. The two systems address the same problem, keeping pork safe for human consumption, through entirely different mechanisms. One mechanism requires electricity. One does not. The error is not having the one that requires electricity. The error is having only that one. Doyle had both. Kevin had one. Now let me tell you about the two paths through the 8-day outage, because the contrast is specific and the numbers are worth knowing. Kevin had lost 380 pounds of pork. Boy, at the retail equivalent of a comparable quality fresh pork cut in 2011, approximately $3.40 per pound for bone and chops, roasts, and ribs, the loss was roughly $1,290 in meat value. The processing cost, the fee to the local locker, had been $180. The hogs themselves had cost Kevin $420 each, $840 total for 2 hogs. Total investment lost on approximately $2,310 in meat and processing cost, plus the sunk cost of the original hog purchase. Additionally, Kevin's family, himself, his wife, and 2 teenage boys, needed to replace that meat over the following months. They bought from the grocery store, which is not the same as farm-raised pork, but is what was available. The replacement cost across the remainder of 2011, approximately $800 in grocery purchases for pork products, equivalent to what they had lost. and total cost of the single-system approach in the summer of 2011, approximately $3,100. Doyle's Smokehouse through the same 8-day outage, unaffected. Total cost of the outage to Doyle's meat supply, zero. The hams continued to age. The shoulders continued to cure. The bacon continued to develop the specific flavor that hickory-smoked country bacon develops across 6 months of aging. When the power came back on July 22nd, nothing in the smokehouse was any different from what it had been on July 14th, because nothing in the smokehouse required power. Let me ask you something. Have you ever lost something in a power outage that you would not have lost if you had maintained the older system alongside the newer one? Have you ever had a single system fail in the specific conditions that single systems are built to fail in? The conditions the designers assumed would not happen, and understood in the loss what redundancy means in a way that efficiency arguments never fully communicate. Kevin drove home that evening with a ham Doyle had cut for him, not out of sympathy. Doyle was not a sympathy man, but because Kevin's family needed meat, and the smokehouse had more than Doyle's family needed, and sharing what the farm produced with the people on the farm was simply what you did. Kevin had grown up understanding this. He had forgotten the other part of it, the part about how the smokehouse produced it without a grid. Somewhere between 2005 and the morning he opened the freezer lid. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if your family still has a smokehouse. Tell me the last year it ran. Let me tell you about the December of 2011, because it is where the story closes and where Kevin makes the decision that closes it properly. The power had come back on July 22nd. Kevin had bought a new chest freezer in August, a larger one, 25 cubic feet, with a surge protector and a temperature alarm that would send a signal to his phone if the internal temperature rose above 40 degrees. He had processed 2 more hogs in November 2011 and filled the new freezer. He had a backup plan this time. If the temperature alarm went off, he could get the meat to the locker in Pulaski within 2 hours. This was a better single system. It was still a single system. In December of 2011, Kevin came to the home place with his older boy, always 14 years old, on the first Saturday of the month. Doyle was in the smokehouse starting the December cure on 2 fresh hams. Kevin watched his father work through the cure, the salt measurement, the brown sugar measurement, the specific rubbing technique that worked the cure into the surface, and the shank joint and the natural cavities where bacteria would otherwise find a foothold. He watched Doyle lay the hams in the cure box he had built from cedar in 1974 and cover them in the remaining cure mix. Kevin's boy watched his grandfather work. He had never been in the smokehouse during a cure. He had known the smokehouse as a building where dark hams hung in the summer and where a specific smell existed that was not unpleasant, but was unlike anything else on the farm. Doyle looked up at Kevin. He said, "You want to learn this?" Kevin said, "Yes." Doyle looked at Kevin's boy. He said, "Both of you?" The boy said, "Yes, sir." Doyle handed Kevin the salt bag. He said, "We'll do the second ham together. Pay attention to the shank joint. That is where it goes wrong if you are not thorough." They spent 2 hours in the smokehouse that Saturday. Doyle talked through each step the way Virgil had talked through each step when Doyle was 12. Not lecturing, explaining, the reasoning behind each decision, why you use plain salt, not curing salt, why the brown sugar is only 4 ounces and not more, why the temperature in the first week of curing matters, and how you read the smokehouse temperature by feel and by the damper rather than by a thermometer. At the end of the 2 hours, Kevin's boy said, "Grandpa, how long does this take to learn?" Doyle said, "A winter." He paused. "The first winter, you learn the cure. The second winter, you learn the smoke. The third winter, you do it yourself, and I watch." He paused. "Your great-grandfather taught me the same way." Kevin's boy looked at the hams in the cure box. He said, "And it keeps all summer without power." Doyle said, "It keeps all summer without power." He looked at the boy. It kept all summer in 1948, and all summer in 1975, and all summer in 2011. He paused. "It will keep all summer in whatever year the power goes out next." Kevin looked at his father. He said, "I should have learned this when you were teaching it the first time." Doyle said, "You're learning it now." He went back to the cure box. That's when you learn something, when you need to know it. He was right about that. Kevin came back the following Saturday and the Saturday after that, and every Saturday through January until the cure was complete, and the hams went on the smoke hooks, and the hickory smoke began to work on them. He came in February when the hams were hanging, and Doyle showed him how to check the surface for any sign of mold and how to wipe them with vinegar if the surface needed attention. He came every month that year. By December of 2012, he did the cure himself with Doyle watching. The smokehouse is still standing. Doyle is 79 now, and Kevin does the processing himself most years. Kevin's boy is 24 and did his own first solo cure last winter the way Kevin did his first solo cure, and Doyle did his, and Virgil did his. With the family's recipe from Virgil's mother's letter, now 66 years of Tennessee farm pork preservation accumulated in a concrete block building that requires 1 cord of split green hickory per year and nothing else. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the preservation systems that do not fail when the grid fails, that produce something better in the long run than what you would have gotten from the fast system, that reward the 3 weeks and the 2 months and the patience that a chest freezer never asked for because a chest freezer has no patience and needs none. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, does your family have a smokehouse? Is it running? What did you cure last winter? Ours, Virgil built the smokehouse in 1948 because he lost 60 pounds of pork in 1936 and decided that a farm with one method of preservation had one way to fail. Kevin lost 380 pounds in 2011 and decided the same thing 75 years later. Doyle has never lost a pound to a power outage in 40 years of farming. Not because he was lucky, because the smokehouse does not require electricity and the chest freezer does, and he has always known both and relied on the one that does not need a grid. That is what Virgil told him to do. He said it once. Doyle listened. It took Kevin a July freezer failure to hear it, but he heard it. The cure is 1 pound of salt and 4 ounces of brown sugar per 10 pounds of meat. Rub it in thoroughly, especially at the shank joint. Leave it for 7 days in the cool of December. Then smoke it for 14 days at 80 to 90 degrees over split green hickory. Then hang it for 60 days minimum. After that, the grid can do whatever it wants. The ham does not care.